Barron Trump, the enigmatic youngest son of one of America's most polarizing families, stepped into the spotlight in a way no one saw coming. An event so astonishing, so utterly mind-blowing, that it's already being called the greatest public showdown of the decade. It all unfolded on a crisp evening in early 2025, when a rabid Zelensky fan, fueled by righteous fury and a thirst for chaos, tried to tear him apart in front of a watching world. What happened next was nothing short of explosive, a single moment so powerful it turned the tables, silenced the crowd, and left jaws on the floor. This isn't just a story, it's a roller coaster of tension, pride, and controversy that will keep you hooked until the very last word. The air buzzed with anticipation on March 3, 2025, as a sleek black SUV rolled through the streets of Washington, D.C. Inside sat Barron Trump, now 18, no longer the quiet child trailing behind his father's larger-than-life shadow. At 6'7", with a chiseled jaw and piercing blue eyes, he carried an aura of unshakable confidence, a young man who had grown up under the relentless glare of scrutiny and emerged sharper for it. That night, he was headed to a high-profile charity gala, one of those glitzy affairs where the elite mingled with the outspoken, and where cameras never stopped rolling. The event, meant to raise funds for displaced families, promised a mix of philanthropy and politics, a volatile cocktail under the best of circumstances. Barron stepped out onto the red carpet, his tailored suit cutting a striking silhouette against the flashing lights. Photographers jostled for shots, their lenses capturing every angle of the young Trump, whose rare public appearances always sparked a frenzy. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some admired his poise, others muttered about his lineage, a name that carried both reverence and revulsion. He moved with purpose, offering a nod here, a faint smile there, his demeanor cool and collected. But beneath the surface, the night was brewing something far more intense than anyone could have predicted. Across the room, a figure watched him with hawk-like focus. Clad in a dark jacket emblazoned with a Ukrainian flag pin, the man stood out not for his attire but for the glint of fervor in his eyes. Known online as Zelensky's bulldog, he was a self-proclaimed activist with a reputation for ambushing public figures he deemed unworthy of their platforms. His social media feeds brimmed with rants about Western privilege, American arrogance, and anyone tied to the Trump name. Tonight he had a target locked in his sights, Barron Trump, and a plan to make headlines. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and the collision course unavoidable. As Barron mingled with guests, shaking hands with diplomats and posing for photos with donors, the atmosphere felt deceptively calm. Servers glided through the room with trays of champagne, crystal glasses clinking in a symphony of wealth and goodwill. The chandelier above cast a warm glow over the scene, illuminating faces both famous and forgotten. Yet for those paying attention, there was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle shift in the air, like the distant rumble of a storm creeping closer. Barron, for his part, seemed oblivious, his focus on the evening's cause. But the Zelensky fan, lurking near the edge of the crowd, was already tightening his grip on the moment he'd been waiting for. The gala's program began with speeches, dry remarks from organizers, heartfelt pleas from beneficiaries, the usual fare. Barron sat near. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The front, his long legs crossed, listening intently as a young woman spoke about her family's flight from conflict. Her words hung heavy in the room, a reminder of the stakes beyond the glamour. The audience applauded, a wave of empathy washing over them. It was the kind of night where unity felt possible, where differences might dissolve in the name of a greater good. But unity, as it so often does, proved fragile. The Zelensky fan saw his opening, and with it, the chance to turn a noble evening into a battlefield. The applause for the young woman's speech had barely faded when the Zelensky fan made his move. He rose from his seat near the back of the ballroom, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. The crowd's attention was still scattered, some reaching for their drinks, others murmuring to their neighbors. When he strode toward the center aisle, a rolled-up pamphlet clutched in his hand like a weapon. His dark jacket caught the light, the Ukrainian flag pin gleaming defiantly, a silent declaration of his cause. Heads began to turn, curiosity replacing the evening's earlier warmth, as he closed the distance to the front where Barron Trump sat. Barron noticed him first as a flicker in his peripheral vision, a shadow moving against the flow of the room. He shifted slightly in his chair, his posture still relaxed but his eyes narrowing, taking in the approaching figure. The Zelensky fan stopped just short of the stage, his boots scuffing the polished floor, and raised his voice to cut through the ambient hum. It wasn't a shout, not yet, but it carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the chatter. Heads swiveled, and a hush fell over the gala as the man's words began to spill out, each one dripping with venom. The room seemed to hold its breath as he launched into his tirade. He spoke of privilege, of silver spoons and unearned legacies, his voice rising with every accusation. He waved the pamphlet, a manifesto of sorts, its pages creased from hours of obsessive folding, pointing it toward Barron like a prosecutor presenting evidence. The crowd leaned forward, some with furrowed brows, others with smirks, all sensing the shift from charity to chaos. Cameras, ever present, zoomed in, their operators eager to capture what promised to be a viral spectacle. Security lingered at the edges, hands on earpieces, waiting for a signal to intervene but not yet moving. Barron remained still, his face an unreadable mask. At 18, he'd grown accustomed to the weight of his name, the way it drew both adoration and rage like a lightning rod. He'd heard the insults before, whispered in school hallways, shouted at rallies, plastered across X in endless threads. But this was different. This was personal, public, and unfolding in real time before an audience of power players and influencers. The Zelensky fan's voice grew louder, his gestures more animated, as he pivoted to his real target. Barron's family, their politics, their wealth, and most controversially their stance, or perceived stance, on Ukraine. The activist's words took a sharp turn, venom giving way to provocation. He invoked Zelensky's name like a battle cry, accusing the Trumps of apathy, of turning their backs on a nation bleeding under fire. Gasps rippled through the room, some offended, some intrigued, as he painted a picture of Barron as a spoiled heir, lounging in luxury while others suffered. It was a narrative designed to wound, to humiliate, to strip away the poised exterior and expose something raw. The tension thickened, a palpable force pressing down on the gala, as eyes darted between the accuser and the accused, waiting for a crack in Barron's calm. But Barron didn't flinch. His hands rested lightly on his knees, fingers steady, betraying no hint of the storm brewing around him. The Zelensky fan, sensing no reaction, pushed harder, stepping closer, his voice now a near shout. He flung out a challenge, daring Barron to respond, to defend himself, to prove he wasn't just a figurehead coasting on his father's coattails. The room teetered on the edge of eruption, guests shifting uncomfortably, whispers turning to murmurs, the air electric with anticipation. The activist's eyes blazed with triumph, certain he'd cornered his prey, that he'd forced Barron into a moment of weakness. Then Barron moved. It was subtle at first, a slow tilt of his head, a slight uncrossing of his legs as he leaned forward in his seat. The motion was so understated it might have gone unnoticed, but in that charged silence it felt seismic. His blue eyes locked onto the Zelensky fan, cutting through the noise with a clarity that stopped the man mid-sentence. The activist faltered, his pamphlet trembling slightly in his grip, as Barron rose to his full height, 6'7" of quiet, towering presence. The room seemed to shrink around him, the spotlight shifting without a word spoken. Whatever came next, it was clear. The hunter had misjudged his quarry, and the real showdown was only just beginning. Barron Trump stood tall, a colossus in the center of the storm, his shadow stretching across the polished floor of the gala ballroom. The Zelensky fan froze, his pamphlet still raised like a flimsy shield, his breath catching as the young Trump's presence filled the space. The crowd, once restless with anticipation, now sat in rapt silence, their eyes darting between the two figures, one a firebrand fueled by righteous fury, the other an enigma whose stillness carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The air crackled with tension, every second stretching into eternity as the room waited for Barron to break, or to break his challenger. The activist recovered quickly, his bravado flickering back to life. He squared his shoulders, jutting his chin forward as if daring Barron to strike. His voice, though unsteady at first, regained its venom, hurling accusations with renewed vigor. He called Barron a puppet, a relic of a tarnished dynasty, a boy playing dress-up in a man's world. The words were meant to sting, to provoke, to drag Barron down into the mud where the Zelensky fan could claim victory. He paced now, a caged animal circling its prey, his flag pin glinting under the chandelier's light as he gestured wildly to the audience, imploring them to see the truth he believed he wielded. But Barron didn't waver. His gaze remained locked on the man, unflinching, a predator's calm amidst the chaos. His silence was deafening, a void that swallowed the activists' shouts and turned them hollow. Guests shifted in their seats, some clutching their drinks tighter, others leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every nuance. The faint curl at the corner of Barron's mouth, the steely resolve in his eyes, the way his hands hung loosely at his sides, betraying no tension. It was a masterclass in composure, and it unnerved the Zelensky fan more than any retort could have. The activist, sensing the tide slipping, doubled down. He thrust the pamphlet toward Barron, its pages fluttering as he jabbed it through the air. He demanded answers, about Ukraine, about privilege, about the Trump legacy, his voice cracking with desperation. The room bristled with unease. This was no longer a mere disruption, but a full-on assault, raw and unfiltered. A few guests whispered to each other, their words lost in the hum, while others watched with wide eyes, torn between discomfort and fascination. Security hovered closer now, their presence a subtle warning, but still, they held back, as if sensing the moment demanded its own resolution. Then Barron took a single step forward. The movement was deliberate, measured, yet it carried the force of a thunderclap. The Zelensky fan faltered mid-rant, his arm dropping slightly as Barron closed the gap between them. Up close, the height difference was staggering. Barron towered over the man, his frame casting a shadow that seemed to dim the activist's fire. The crowd held its collective breath, the silence so thick it pressed against the walls. The Zelensky fan's bravado withered under that gaze, his words stuttering to a halt, leaving only the echo of his last accusation hanging in the air. Barron's lips parted, and the room seemed to lean in as one. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and cutting, a blade wrapped in velvet. He spoke only one line, a single sentence that landed like a sledgehammer, shattering the activists' momentum and sending a ripple of shock through the gala. The Zelensky fan's face blanched, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a comeback that wouldn't come. The crowd erupted, not in cheers or boos, but in a chaotic symphony of gasps, murmurs, and stifled laughter, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the room. What Barron said in that moment was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that it flipped the script entirely. The Zelensky fan staggered back a step, his pamphlet slipping from his fingers to the floor, its pages splaying out in defeat. Barron didn't move, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, his expression unchanged, as the weight of his words settled over the scene like ash after an explosion. The activist's humiliation was complete, not through shouting or force, but through a quiet, devastating precision that left no room for recovery. The gala, once a stage for charity, had become an arena, and Barron Trump had just claimed it as his own. The pamphlet lay crumpled on the floor, its edges curling inward as if shrinking from the weight of the moment. The Zelensky fan stood rooted to the spot, his chest heaving, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning defeat. Barron Trump's single, piercing line still hung in the air, its echo reverberating through the ballroom like a shockwave that refused to fade. The crowd's reaction swelled, a chaotic blend of astonishment, amusement, and unease, rolling over the scene in waves. Some guests clapped hesitantly, unsure if applause was appropriate, while others whispered furiously, their eyes darting between Barron and the activist, trying to unravel what had just happened. Barron remained motionless, his towering figure a pillar of calm amid the storm he'd unleashed. His blue eyes flickered briefly over the fallen pamphlet, then back to the Zelensky fan, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. The activist's hands twitched at his sides, his bravado extinguished, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. He'd come armed with righteous fury, expecting to dismantle Barron in front of the world, but instead he'd been undone, disarmed by a sentence so sharp it had sliced through his entire narrative. The cameras caught every second, zooming in on his flushed cheeks, his trembling jaw, the Ukrainian flag pin now a lonely emblem of a lost cause. The gala's organizers scrambled to regain control, one of them stepping toward a microphone with a forced smile, attempting to steer the evening back to its charitable roots. But the room was too far gone, its energy hijacked by the clash that had just unfolded. Guests twisted in their seats, craning their necks for a better view, while phones emerged from pockets and purses, fingers tapping furiously to immortalize the moment on X posts were already flying. Cryptic snippets about Barron's takedown, wild guesses at what he'd said, hashtags like Barron vs Zelensky fan trending within minutes. The internet was alight, and the gala was no longer about displaced families. It was about Barron Trump. The Zelensky fan took a shaky step backward, his gaze darting to the crowd as if seeking an ally, a lifeline. None came. The faces staring back were a mix of pity, curiosity, and outright glee, none willing to step into the ring he'd so boldly entered. He bent to snatch his pamphlet from the floor, his movements jerky, almost frantic, as if reclaiming it might restore some shred of his dignity. But the damage was done. Barron's words had stripped him bare, exposing the fragility beneath his zealotry, and the audience had seen it all. Security finally moved in, their approach slow and deliberate, hands outstretched to guide him away, but not before he cast one last, wild glance at Barron. That glance met a wall of indifference. Barron turned slightly, his attention shifting to the front of the room where the next speaker was being introduced. It was a subtle dismissal, a signal that the confrontation was beneath him, already a footnote in his night. The Zelensky fan was escorted out, his head bowed, the sound of his boots scuffing the floor drowned out by the rising hum of the crowd. As the doors closed behind him, a strange stillness settled, punctured only by the nervous laughter of a few guests and the clink of a glass tipping over somewhere in the back. The gala resumed, but it was a hollow imitation of what it had been. The speeches continued, earnest words about hope and rebuilding, but the audience's focus lingered on Barron. He sat back down, crossing his legs once more, his expression as unreadable as ever. Whispers swirled around him, speculation about his line, admiration for his poise, debates over whether he'd planned it all along. Some saw him as a hero, a young lion defending his pride, others branded him ruthless, a product of his family's unapologetic edge. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. He'd turned a would-be humiliation into a triumph, and the world was watching. Outside, the Zelensky fan stumbled into the night, the cool March air biting at his skin. He clutched his pamphlet tighter, his mind replaying the moment Barron had spoken. That line, it gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't extract. He'd come to break Barron Trump to expose him, but instead he'd been the one broken. As he disappeared into the shadows of D.C., the gala carried on, its glittering facade intact. But beneath it, a new story was taking root, one that would spread far beyond the ballroom, fueled by curiosity, controversy, and the unshakable image of Barron standing tall. The gala pressed on, its rhythm restored but its soul irrevocably altered. The chandeliers still gleamed, casting their golden light over the room, but the glow felt artificial now, a veneer stretched thin over the raw energy poolsing beneath. Barron Trump sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, the picture of restraint as the next speaker droned on about global solidarity. Yet his presence dominated the space, not through noise or grand gestures, but through the sheer force of what he'd done. That single line, still a mystery to most, had ignited a firestorm, and its embers were already spreading far beyond the ballroom's walls. Guests stole glances at him, their curiosity a living thing that darted through the crowd. Some scribbled notes on napkins, others tapped out theories on their phones, each trying to piece together the puzzle of Barron's retort. The words themselves remained elusive, whispered only by those close enough to hear, guarded like a secret too potent to share. But the impact was undeniable. It had shifted the night's narrative, turning a routine charity event into a crucible where reputations were forged or shattered. Barron, once a peripheral figure in the Trump saga, had stepped into the spotlight, and the audience couldn't look away. Outside, the Zelensky fan slumped against a lamppost, the DC night wrapping around him like a shroud. The pamphlet in his hands was crumpled beyond recognition, its ink smudged from the sweat of his palms. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one laced with the sting of failure. He'd pictured this moment so differently, envisioned himself as a warrior, a voice for the voiceless, striking a blow against the privileged elite. Instead, he'd been dismantled, his crusade reduced to a punchline by a teenager half his age. Barron's voice replayed in his mind, that low, steady cadence slicing through his defenses, leaving him exposed and powerless. Back inside, the Gala's veneer began to crack. A prominent diplomat at a nearby table leaned toward his companion, his voice a hushed murmur as he speculated about Barron's motives. Was it calculated, a rehearsed strike from a young man groomed for battle? Or was it instinct, a flash of brilliance born from the heat of the moment? Across the room, a journalist with a reputation for stirring controversy typed furiously, her fingers a blur as she crafted a headline that would set X ablaze. Barron Trump humiliates Zelensky superfan in Gala Showdown. The post went live, and within minutes, the digital world erupted, amplifying the night's chaos to a global scale. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. The Zelensky fan felt the shift before he saw it. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, notifications piling up like debris from a wreck. He pulled it out with trembling hands, the screen lighting up his hollowed face. The first post he saw was a clip, grainy, shaky footage from a guest's phone, capturing the moment Barron rose to his feet. The audio was muffled, but the activist's own shouts rang clear, followed by the devastating pause and Barron's blurred response. Comments flooded in. Some mocked his fervor, others praised Barron's ice-cold delivery, and a few, his loyal followers, rallied to his defense, calling it a setup. But the tide was against him, and he knew it. Inside, Barron remained an island of calm as the gala trudged toward its close. The final speech ended, and guests rose to mingle, their conversations buzzing with the night's defining moment. A cluster of donors approached him, their smiles wide and their praise effusive, but Barron kept his responses brief, his tone polite yet distant. He shook hands, nodded at compliments, and deflected questions about the confrontation with a practiced ease that only fueled the intrigue. To them, he was a victor, a young titan who'd turned an attack into a coronation. But his eyes betrayed nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, just a quiet vigilance that kept the world at arm's length. The Zelensky fan, meanwhile, scrolled through the deluge of posts, each one a fresh wound. His name, or rather his online alias, was trending now, tied to hashtags like Zelensky fail and Barron beast. Memes sprouted like weeds, his pamphlet mid-flight, Barron looming over him, captions twisting the knife deeper. His followers dwindled, unfollows ticking up as the narrative solidified. He was the fool, the overzealous agitator who'd picked the wrong fight. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tight, and started walking, the city's shadows swallowing him whole. The night wasn't over for him, not yet, and the sting of Barron's triumph was only beginning to sink in. As the gala emptied out, Barron lingered near the exit, his driver idling outside. A reporter darted toward him, recorder in hand, but a quick glance from Barron stopped her cold. He stepped into the night, the cool air brushing against his face, and disappeared into the SUV without a backward glance. Behind him, the ballroom echoed with the ghosts of the evening, a clash that had redefined him, humiliated another, and set the stage for a reckoning no one could predict. The black SUV glided through the streets of Washington, D.C., its tinted windows sealing Barron Trump from the chaos he'd left behind. The city lights streaked past in a blur, reflecting off the glass, but inside the atmosphere was still. Barron sat with his head tilted back, eyes half closed, as if the night's events were already a distant memory. His phone buzzed softly on the seat beside him, a steady pulse of notifications he ignored. The world outside was catching fire, but Barron moved through it like a shadow, untouchable, his silence amplifying the legend now taking shape. Miles away, the Zelensky fan trudged along a dimly lit sidewalk, the weight of his defeat sinking deeper with every step. His boots scraped against the pavement, a rhythmic scrape that matched the pounding in his skull. The pamphlet, now a tattered relic, peeked out of his jacket pocket, its edges frayed from his restless gripping. He stopped checking his phone. The flood of mockery had become a roar he couldn't mute, but the sting of it lingered, sharp and unrelenting. He wanted to be a hero, a voice that shook the powerful from their thrones. Instead, he'd become a punchline, and Barron Trump had made it look effortless. Online, the story metastasized. X was a battlefield of opinions, memes, and hot takes, each post feeding the frenzy. The grainy gala clip had been viewed millions of times, dissected frame by armchair analysts and influencers alike. Some hailed Barron as a prodigy, a quiet warrior who'd inherited his family's knack for turning adversity into gold. Others condemned him, spinning tales of arrogance and entitlement, claiming his line, still a whispered enigma to most, was a cheap shot from a spoiled heir. The Zelensky fans' supporters dwindled further, their defenses drowned out by the tide of ridicule, while his detractors reveled in his fall. In a cramped apartment across town, a young blogger hunched over her laptop, her fingers flying as she pieced together a timeline. She'd been at the gala, unnoticed in the back, and had caught Barron's words on her recorder, a scoop she guarded like treasure. Her post was nearly ready, a detailed breakdown of the confrontation, complete with the elusive line that had turned the tide. She hesitated over the publish button, knowing it would ignite a new wave of chaos. Was it a public service or a Pandora's box? The clock ticked past midnight, and with a deep breath she hit send. Within minutes, her site crashed under the traffic, but the words were out, racing across the digital ether. Back at the Trump residence, Barron stepped into the quiet of his room, the gala's clamor a world away. He shed his jacket, tossing it over a chair, and glanced at his phone for the first time. The screen glowed with alerts, news headlines, X mentions, texts from friends who'd seen the clips. One message stood out from an old classmate. "Dude, you're a legend. What did you even say?" Barron's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile, but he didn't reply. He set the phone face down and crossed to the window, staring out at the sprawling estate bathed in moonlight. The night felt heavier now, its consequences stretching beyond his control. Meanwhile, the Zelensky fan found himself in a dive bar, the kind of place where the lights flickered and the air smelled of stale beer. He slumped into a booth, his pamphlet spread out on the table like a map of his unraveling. A TV in the corner played a news segment, the anchor's voice cutting through the haze. Barron Trump's viral takedown of an activist at tonight's gala has sparked heated debate. The activist's head snapped up, his stomach lurching as his own face flashed on-screen mid-rant, followed by Barron's towering silhouette. The bartender smirked, oblivious to the man in the booth, and muttered, "Kids got guts." The Zelensky fan's fist clenched, crumpling the pamphlet further. The blogger's post hit X like a thunderbolt, the line finally revealed to the masses. It spread like wildfire, quoted and misquoted, twisted into memes and manifestos. The words were simple yet surgical, a barb that had struck at the activist's core and left him defenseless. Reactions poured in: laughter, outrage, disbelief, each one fueling the story's ascent. Political pundits weighed in, some decrying the exchange as a symptom of a fractured society, others praising Barron's restraint as a masterstroke. The controversy swelled, divisive and unrelenting, splitting the public into camps as fiercely as any Trump moment before it. Barron, still at his window, felt the world shift beneath him. He hadn't sought this, not the fame, not the fight, but it had found him anyway. The gala was just the beginning, a spark that had lit a fuse he couldn't snuff out. Outside, the night stretched on, vast and unyielding, while inside he stood alone, a young man caught in the eye of a storm he'd unwittingly unleashed. And somewhere in the city, the Zelensky fan stared into his drink, the bitter taste of defeat mingling with a growing resolve. Because for him, this wasn't the end, but a wound that demanded reckoning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting Washington, D.C. into a twilight glow as Barron Trump stood on the balcony of the Trump estate, the city skyline a jagged silhouette in the distance. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of a world still reeling from the gala. His coffee had gone cold, but he held the mug anyway, its weight a grounding force against the storm he knew was coming. The Zelensky fan's cryptic post, "This isn't over, he'll see," had lingered in his mind, not as a threat but as a curiosity. Barron didn't chase battles, but he didn't run from them either, and whatever the activist had planned, he'd meet it head-on. In a cluttered basement across town, the Zelensky fan hunched over a makeshift setup, a laptop, a ring light, and a cheap microphone perched on a stack of books. His hands trembled as he adjusted the camera, his reflection staring back from the screen, hollow-eyed, unshaven, but burning with a renewed fire. The manifesto he'd spent the day crafting wasn't just words. It was a Molotov cocktail, a raw, unfiltered call-out aimed straight at Barron Trump. He hit record, his voice low and steady at first, then rising with a passion that shook the walls. "You think one line can bury me?" he began, his eyes locked on the lens. "You think silence makes you untouchable? I'm not done, Barron. The world's going to see you for what you are." The video went live at midnight, uploaded to X, YouTube, and every corner of the internet he could reach. It was 6 minutes of fury, accusations of cowardice, privilege, and complicity, woven with grainy gala footage and a plea for others to join his cause. He didn't just attack Barron, he challenged him to respond, to step out from his ivory tower and face the reckoning in public. The Ukrainian flag pin gleamed on his jacket, a battered symbol of his defiance as he ended with a vow. "I'll be at Lafayette Square tomorrow night. Show up or prove you're nothing." The screen went black and the upload triggered a digital earthquake. By dawn, the video had millions of views, its reach fueled by outrage, curiosity, and the insatiable appetite of a polarized online world. X exploded anew, #Lafayette Showdown trending alongside Barron's Stand Up, the activist's gauntlet splitting the narrative once more. His followers, though diminished, rallied with fervent posts, while Barron's defenders mocked the desperate stunt. News outlets pounced, helicopters buzzing over Lafayette Square by mid-morning, cameras poised for a spectacle. The Zelensky fan had turned his humiliation into a dare, and the pressure was on Barron to answer, or ignore it at his peril. Barron watched the video in silence, seated at his desk with the laptop open. The activist's words washed over him, each barb a test of his resolve. His security team hovered nearby, their voices a low murmur about risks and optics, but Barron waved them off. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window, the city poolsing beyond. Lafayette Square wasn't just a place, it was a stage, a historic battleground where protests and power had clashed for centuries. To go was to play the game, to stay was to let the activist claim a hollow victory. The choice gnawed at him, not out of fear but out of calculation. The day stretched on, tension coiling tighter with every hour. Crowds gathered at Lafayette Square by dusk, activists with signs, Trump supporters in red hats, onlookers hungry for drama. The Zelensky fan arrived early, packing near the park's edge, his jacket zipped tight against the chill. His video had promised a showdown, and he stood ready, eyes scanning the horizon for Barron's silhouette. Media vans lined the streets, their lights casting a harsh glow, while drones hummed overhead, capturing every angle. The air buzzed with anticipation, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Then, as the clock struck 8, a black SUV rolled up to the square's perimeter. The crowd surged, phones raised, shouts erupting as the door opened. Barron stepped out, his 6'7" frame cutting through the chaos like a blade. He wore no suit this time, just a dark coat and jeans, his expression as unreadable as ever. The Zelensky fan froze, his breath catching as Barron approached, each step deliberate, his presence silencing the noise around them. The cameras zoomed in, the world holding its breath for the final act. Barron stopped a few feet away, his blue eyes locking onto the activists. The Zelensky fan opened his mouth, ready to unleash his rehearsed tirade, but Barron raised a hand, a subtle, commanding gesture that stopped him cold. "You wanted me here," Barron said, his voice low but carrying over the din. "I'm here. Now what?" The question hung there, simple yet loaded, stripping the activists' grand challenge down to its bones. The crowd leaned in, the activist's face twitching as he searched for a response, his momentum faltering. The Zelensky fan stammered, his words tripping over themselves, something about accountability, about facing the truth. But they lacked the fire of his video dissolving into the night air. Barron didn't interrupt, didn't argue, he just stood there letting the man unravel. The silence that followed was louder than any shout, a void that swallowed the activists' last stand. The crowd sensed it, their energy shifting. Some cheered, others jeered, but all felt the weight of the moment. Barron had answered the call, not with fireworks, but with a quiet, unshakable force that left no room for doubt. As the activist's voice faded, Barron turned and walked back to the SUV, the sea of people parting around him. The Zelensky fan stood alone, his flag pinned dull in the artificial light, his fight extinguished not by a battle but by its absence. The cameras kept rolling, the story already writing itself. Barron Trump, the enigma, had faced the storm and walked away taller. The SUV disappeared into the night, leaving Lafayette Square buzzing with a tale that would echo for years. A controversial, electrifying clash that ended not in chaos, but in a stillness that spoke louder than words. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.